Doom 64 is a curious entry in the pages of gaming history. The first game of the franchise developed outside of id Software, released solely for the Nintendo 64, and maintained a lot of the established Doom principles at a time when first-person shooters were experiencing a revolution. When compared to games released within the same period, notably Quake on PC and Nintendo 64's Turok Dinosaur Hunter and GoldenEye 007, it seems dated and lackluster. But there's still a lot of interesting things to explore here, and with the re-release of the game coinciding with Doom Eternal, what better time to revisit and explore it in detail. I'm Tommy Thompson, and in this episode of Design Dive, I'm here to offer some absolution. It's a joke. It's an in-joke, like a joke, whatever, let's just get on with this. By 1997, Doom had spread its message of demon-blasting mayhem across a vast sect of the games industry. Doom and Doom 2 were released for PC in 1993 and 94 respectively. Meanwhile, Ultimate Doom in 1995 re-released the original game to a broader market with a new episode. In the meantime, the original game was subsequently ported to the Sega 32X, Atari Jaguar, Super Nintendo, PlayStation 3DO and Sega Saturn, to varying levels of quality. But while we would be waiting until 2004 for Doom 3, the next major entry in the franchise, there were still efforts to placate an audience hungry for more. id Software released Final Doom in 1996, a collection of 2-level or WAD packs for Doom 2, originally developed by modders, Team TNT and the Casale brothers, that were later subsequently licensed and released as a commercial product by id and GT Interactive. But more critically, 1997 saw the release of Doom 64, an entirely new game in the Doom franchise that was not only exclusive to the Nintendo 64 and never re-released until now, but wasn't even developed by id Software. The now defunct Midway Games, famous for licensing arcade titles such as Space Invaders and Pac-Man in the US, as well as being the creators of Mortal Kombat, started development in 1994 with id overseeing the project. Doom 64 carries 32 levels exclusive to this game, with many of the core mechanics, weapons and enemies of the first two games retained, but with changes to aesthetic, map and enemy design and some very subtle gameplay tweaks. It's an often overlooked but fascinating chapter in the Doom franchise, a genuine sequel to Doom 2 that experiments with some of the design pillars we'd eventually see in Doom 3. All the while bringing new gameplay and rendering features that help innovate but still retain that feeling of classic Doom at a time that the industry as a whole was moving away from it. And it has remained hidden from the wider world until the 2020 re-release, as the game has never officially been ported to other platforms until now. It's been bouncing around in the PC mod space for years, with the likes of the Doom 64 Total Conversion or TC port, often known as Absolution, followed by Doom 64 EX, which was a much more accurate reproduction of the game. It's only now, as elements of Doom 64's lore have surfaced in both Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, that the game is finally receiving some long overdue attention. With this return, it's worth looking at the ways the game deviates from the formula and provides a unique snapshot of the Doom experience that's still worth trying out all these years later. What is undoubtedly Doom 64's greatest strength is its tone. It's a game of moody and atmospheric lighting, with ominous and creepy music alongside a variety of guttural snarls and growls from the variety of enemy AI within the game. It re-establishes the terror of the franchise at a time when it was waning. Sure, it's a little quaint now when you consider the more nightmarish creatures of recent episodes, but the original Doom could prove scary for players caught up in the thrill of it. But the now outdated graphics compared to the likes of 1996's Quake made it feel a lot less threatening. Plus, while other N64 shooters, such as Turok and GoldenEye, embraced fully 3D rendered environments and characters, it seemed like the now aging Doom engine couldn't deliver a game with a unique aesthetic and style that would capture a player's imagination anymore. Doom 64 is built on a heavily modified version of the original engine, hence sticking with the traditional angled and aggressive geometry, but also the use of 2D sprites for enemies. That said, the modifications to the engine are extensive and it completely shifts the tone of the game. Enemies are rendered from high-poly 3D models built on Silicon Graphics workstations, giving them a lot more visceral detail. The engine is capable of rendering more atmospheric lighting with use of coloured lights and even fog to obscure the player's view. The soundtrack ditches the more heavy metal-inspired themes for something more ominous and unsettling. Plus, the environment art leans a lot more into the hellish iconography, with pentagrams and other satanic themes throughout. When you put all this together, it creates a mood and tone that is strikingly different from the previous games. Despite the fact this is, for all intents and purposes, a sequel to Doom 1 and 2 and the final expansion, it feels like something else entirely. The tighter, darker environments force a more methodical playthrough rather than guns blazing. Plus, one of the additional features built into the level editor is a more nuanced macro system. This results in the likes of switches that completely change the shape of rooms, or tripwire booby traps that fire arrows or explosives. Even the now established principles of enemies teleporting into rooms is achieved through an immediate fade-in rather than a louder and more progressive teleportation sequence like in previous games. Hence, rushing through environments is now laced with peril, with many an opportunity to take unwanted damage, or potentially be trapped surrounded by too many demons in an awkward situation. It's the first of the series that arguably forces you to not rush into a room with the intent of wiping everything out, as you can all too easily find yourself in a spot of trouble. However, it achieves a rewarding middle ground compared to the likes of Doom 3, a game that arguably employs this too heavily and results in the player often walking one step forward, only to take 3 steps back and expend a lot of ammo. Outside of the overall mood and aesthetic, there is also a shift in the enemy AI and behaviour, which, I gotta talk about, ranging from the levels of aggression to order of introduction and even the enemy types themselves. Doom has a rather infamous collection of enemy archetypes, from the sluggish zombie men and rushing pinky demons to the air attacks of the Cacodemon and Lost Souls. The enemies introduced across both Doom and Doom 2 have become the template archetypes for many an open arena first-person shooter. Each has a unique combination of movement speed and range, fire rate, projectile type and overall health that all help reinforce the need to be constantly reprioritizing targets and knowing when to fight or flee. Doom 64 delivers a slightly more focused interpretation of this combat puzzle, given that there are only 13 enemies from the first 2 games that make a reappearance. The Zombie Man, Shotgun Guy, Imp, Pinky Demon, Spectre Demons, Cacodemon, Hell Knight, Baron of Hell, Mancubus, Arachnotron, Lost Souls, Pain Elementals, and the Cyber Demon, meaning that 3 enemies from Doom 2, the Commandos, Revenants, and Archviles, plus the Spider Demon boss of the first Doom are not included. It's been suggested the tight deadlines and storage limitations of the Nintendo 64 cartridges are the reason these enemies are missing, but given the Archvile is a total tool, I'm happy for him to be anywhere the f*** else at this point. That said, there are 2 new enemies, the Nightmare Imp and the Mother Demon, the boss monster of the game. The Nightmare Imp is a faster, more aggressive and slightly translucent variant on the original, and was reportedly a leftover from the PlayStation port of the original Doom, given it has nightmare variants of Spectres and Cacodemons, which were later added to the Doom 64 TC port. Well, the Mother Demon is the endgame boss and the first enemy in Doom history that attacks you with 2 different attacks at the same time, with flame trails and homing missiles. This slightly distilled Doom experience still delivers, but as a fan of the series, it's an exciting deviation from the originals, given the number of small tweaks made to individual behaviours, as well as the changes made to the makeup and distribution of enemy types in specific maps. Enemy aggression is rebalanced alongside some slight changes to attack behaviour, which, alongside the more claustrophobic environments, can often mean players are punished quickly for their mistakes. For example, zombie men now deal more damage, the Barons and Hell Knights are more likely to infight with one another, Lost Souls are now weaker and take only 1 shotgun round, while Pain Elemental's spawn attack rate is increased and deals proximity damage. Arachnotrons fire 2 rounds at a time but in concentrated bursts, and the Cyber Demon leads its shots better than in previous games. All of this makes subtle impact on the overall pacing and spatial puzzle solving, but without compromising the core fun of the game. In amongst all this, one of the more interesting elements is the way in which enemy archetypes are selected throughout. Unlike the first Doom games, which started with zombie men, shotgun guys, and then a handful of imps, Doom 64 mixes it up straight away. The first level on the higher difficulties introduces over a dozen pinky demons, surrounded by hordes of soldiers and 1 solitary imp at the exit. Followed by spectres in level 2, nightmare imps, cacodemons and lost souls in level 3, and your first Hell Knight in level 4. When you compare this to the earlier Doom games, it's bringing in more challenging archetypes much earlier, upping the difficulty in new and interesting ways. It's interesting because it acts as more of a remix of Doom, and much more in line with Final Doom than the first two games or even Doom 3 or 2016 in how it messes around with enemy order. Doom 64 is, for many, myself included, one of the greatest entries in the franchise that deserves a lot more love than it actually received at release. It's a game that suffered largely because it lacked many of the innovations and mechanics in 3D rendering that other shooters of its era were pushing, with Quake and its successors ultimately bearing down upon it. It's fantastic to see that after over 20 years the game is finally given an official re-release, and for many who missed out on it originally can embrace its darker and more foreboding mark on the franchise. The port of the game is released by Night Dive Studios, who ironically have already ported Turok Dinosaur Hunter, and that work was exceptional, so I'm confident Doom 64 is in safe hands. Thanks for watching this episode of Design Dive. I'm going to disappear into a cave for the next month as I replay Doom 64 for the 50th time, albeit the first time on an officially licensed port, alongside of course a full playthrough of Doom Eternal. And if I have some opinions on that game, and odds are I will, I'll be back to talk all about it next month. In the meantime, please help support my work like these awesome people: Andre Shook, Yangtze River, Lexa Fate, and Matt Ward, alongside all my other wonderful supporters on Patreon. YouTube is a fickle business, and despite recently breaking my 100,000 subscriber milestone, it's still a volatile space within which to survive, so even a buck or two is a huge help towards ensuring AI in games continues to grow. Alright, I'm off to rip and tear. Have a good one, folks. I'll be back.